In the long, brutal mosaic of World War II, a handful of stories slipped through the cracks, episodes so improbable, so quiet that they were nearly lost to salt water and censorship. This is one of them. A hospital ship, unarmed by international law, painted white with red crosses large enough to be seen from the clouds, somehow slipped past an entire Wolfpack of German U-boats without firing a single shot. For decades, the incident was redacted, its details scattered across naval logs, decrypted intercepts, and a handful of shaken testimonies. The truth survived only because the ship did. It began like so many voyages in the mid-war Atlantic. A hospital ship underway, its engines pushing tirelessly against the long swell, carrying wounded from North Africa towards safer ports. Its mission was humanitarian, but the ocean around it was not. By 1943, the Kriegsmarine's Wolfpacks had turned the North Atlantic into a graveyard. Even vessels marked as protected targets under the Hague Convention occasionally vanished, torpedoed in accidents, misidentified in storms, or simply ignored by aggressive commanders. And on this particular morning, as the ship pushed eastward, its fresh coat of white paint glowed in the cold light like a beacon. A blessing for the wounded, a target for the desperate. The red crosses on her deck were unmistakable. They were meant to shield her from the war, but deep below the waves a periscope rose, slow, cautious, predatory. The U-boat commander knew the rules, but rules had become fragile things. Wolfpack orders fluctuated with the political tide. Some captains followed them, some invented their own. In the dim green glow of his control room, the commander studied the ship through his periscope lens, uncertain whether to shadow or strike. And so he called it in. One sighting became 3, then 5. A full Wolfpack began to take shape around the solitary hospital ship, fanning out through cold Atlantic water. Night fell like a closing fist. The moon lit the convoy routes to the north, and the hospital ship held her line alone. She had no escort. None was permitted. Dozens of eyes watched from below the sea, waiting for a mistake. An unauthorized light signal, a suspected troop transport disguised in white, anything that could justify an attack. The captain knew this, and he walked the bridge with silent intensity. The ship's lights followed strict wartime protocols. Visibility high enough to mark her as non-combatant, dim enough to keep from serving as a guidepost for the enemy. But then came the first anomaly. A subtle shift in the light configuration. A deliberate alteration. Not bright enough to be seen from afar, but detectable to anyone tailing her through the waves. The move seemed reckless, almost self-destructive. In truth, it was the first step in a carefully engineered deception based on intelligence so new that only a handful of Allied officers even knew it existed. A storm front crept across the horizon, dark and ragged. The captain studied it, calculating not just its timing but how the U-boats would react. He summoned his navigation team, and they bent over the charts under red lamps, searching for opportunities. Overlaps of weather, swell, and radio dead zones. They weren't plotting an escape route, they were designing confusion. Meanwhile, across the darkening sea, U-boat sonar teams tracked her screws with clinical precision. Every change in speed was noted, every alteration in bearing relayed through low-frequency communication lines. The Wolfpack adjusted, tightening its net. The hospital ship's engines droned steadily, but the ocean behind her told a different story. A widening wake drawn in patterns that made no tactical sense. A zigzag too shallow to be evasive, too inconsistent to be accidental. And then came the intelligence broadcast. Officers on the bridge gathered around the crackling receiver as a coded update arrived from Allied command. a decrypted German transmission. A single phrase that changed the stakes entirely. The Wolfpack believed the ship might be a disguised troop carrier. If that suspicion solidified, the red crosses would mean nothing. Fog seeped in like spilled ink. Visibility collapsed. For a moment, both hunters and hunted drifted in a featureless gray corridor. The ship's captain seized his chance. He ordered a maneuver no hospital ship had ever attempted, something bordering on reckless but precisely calibrated against what the Germans expected. Noise discipline changed. Light signatures changed. The vessel moved through the fog not like a ship trying to escape, but like one trying to maintain a course it no longer had. Inside the U-boats, confusion grew. Operators lost the signal. Bearings fluctuated wildly as echoes bounced off pockets of cold water and storm-warped waves. The Wolfpack was still close, too close, but its cohesion was fracturing. The white ship slid deeper into the fog bank, and for the first time that night, uncertainty began to work in her favor. On deck, medical staff braced themselves. They knew they were still within range of torpedoes. They knew one misread signal or one overzealous commander could end everything in minutes. Yet they continued their work, tending to the wounded who were unaware their lives hung on the thin margin between hesitation and aggression. The captain issued the next crucial order, a timed turn that would exploit the storm's frontal edge. This was the moment the ship would either vanish or die. The crew moved with disciplined silence, knowing the success of the entire operation rested on how convincingly they could appear lost. Lightning cracked somewhere behind them, illuminating the clouds. It was enough to reveal the path ahead, turbulence that could mask their remaining light, wind strong enough to scatter any lingering sonar trace. The storm became their shield, and as the first sheets of rain swept across the bow, the hospital ship crossed the invisible line that separated the hunted from the uncatchable. Behind them, the Wolfpack struggled to re-establish order. One U-boat overshot its search pattern. Another misread a thermal inversion as a course correction by the target. The shared radio net that normally unified the pack now fed contradictions into every headset. Some captains believed the ship had turned north toward convoy lanes. Others believed she had slowed. One insisted she had reversed course entirely. In the chaos, a single fact held: nobody had a confirmed visual anymore. Hours passed before the storm softened into a quiet, trembling horizon. The sea looked newborn, washed, pale, and free of silhouettes. For the crew of the hospital ship, the absence of torpedo wakes felt unreal. They half expected a periscope to pierce the surface at any moment, metal gleaming like a shark's eye. But the ocean remained still. The ship's medical staff, unaware of the intricate dance that had just saved them, moved along the deck checking the wounded. Some had been pulled from battlefields just days earlier. Others carried the dull, resigned expressions of soldiers who had seen too much. Their lives were no longer measured in victories or defeats, only in miles left to sail before reaching safety. Below decks, the captain finally allowed himself a moment of stillness. He reviewed the night in reverse, replaying every decision. The altered light pattern meant to mimic a damaged generator, the calculated speed drops used to distort sonar bearings, the storm-fed maneuver that forced the pack to guess instead of hunt. None of these tactics belonged to a hospital ship. They belonged to a vessel operating in the thin gray space between survival and the laws of war. And yet, not a single shot had been fired. Not a single rule had been broken. The captain had used the ocean itself as a weapon, shaping the perceptions of the hunters until they questioned their own instruments. By morning, the ship's horizon was a calm, unbroken line. The crew found themselves looking at a sea that no longer held the memory of danger. Their escape was complete, but its meaning would take longer to process. Some celebrated quietly, relief rather than triumph. Others simply stared at the water, trying to understand how they were still alive. The wounded felt the shift too. Even those drifting in and out of morphine sleep sensed the change in footsteps, the way conversations softened, the way the ship seemed to breathe again. Survival had a sound, a subtle release of tension that traveled through steel bulkheads and into the hearts of men who had thought themselves doomed. Word of the escape traveled slowly through Allied command. At first, the incident seemed impossible. A lone hospital ship outmaneuvering a coordinated Wolfpack? But the logs confirmed it. Radio intercepts confirmed it. And eventually even decrypted German signals acknowledged the strange disappearance in the storm. Some U-boat commanders argued the ship had hidden behind a decoy. Others claimed she had been escorted by an unknown Allied craft. None believed she had slipped past them by her own means. It would take months before fragments of the truth assembled into a coherent picture. The Allied Intelligence Bureau eventually noted the event in a confidential file, a brief, almost clinical report summarizing how environmental conditions, deception signals, and navigational misdirection had allowed a non-combatant vessel to evade one of the most dangerous formations in the Atlantic. The file ended with a terse recommendation. Consider the value of nonviolent evasive tactics for vulnerable naval units. Years later, long after the war ended, the document was quietly declassified. It revealed no heroics, no torpedoes, no daring rescue. Only a handful of officers, a storm, and a ship whose only weapon was its ability to remain what it was, a sanctuary on the water. As the ship finally approached safe harbor, its decks filled with the familiar rhythms of recovery. Rescued wounded were brought topside to feel fresh air after days of confinement. Some smiled weakly at the gulls overhead, reminders that land was near. Crewmen who had spent the night soaked and exhausted found themselves laughing, thin, frayed laughter that only comes from those who have returned from the edge. No medals awaited them, no headlines. Their survival was a secret between them and the sea. When the engine slowed and the coastline came into view, the captain gave the order to stand down from silent running procedures. Normal operations resumed. Lights returned to regulation brightness. The ship, for the first time in days, looked exactly as she was meant to look, a beacon of mercy in a world where mercy had grown rare. The last entry in the ship's own logbook was simple. Contact lost with hostile units. No casualties. Mission continues. In the vast history of World War II, where battles swallowed entire cities and fleets, it is easy to overlook such a quiet victory. But stories like this remind us that the war was not shaped solely by guns and steel. It was shaped by choices, by captains who refused to surrender to despair, by crews who held their nerve in darkness, by moments when human ingenuity outweighed brute force. The hospital ship that outsmarted an entire Wolfpack without firing a shot did more than survive. It proved that even in a conflict defined by unprecedented violence, the greatest victories sometimes came from preserving life rather than taking it. And in that narrow, fog-drenched corridor of the Atlantic, the legacy of the Second World War was written not in explosions but in silence, the kind of silence that saves instead of destroys.